You know, we like to think of history as this big, logical story. But what if the most important chapters were never really planned? What if the world changes, not because of some grand idea, but just because one person dies at exactly the wrong moment? That's what we're going to explore today, the absolute chaos that follows a power vacuum.
Yeah, we're all taught to see history as this orderly line, right? Cause leads to effect, a revolution happens, a new government forms, a treaty gets signed. And it's kind of comforting to believe that big events have these big, clear causes. But you know what? That's rarely the full story.
What if they're actually messy and sudden and totally unpredictable? The really dangerous deaths aren't the ones we see coming. No, they're the ones that show up before anyone's ready, and they expose just how fragile the systems we all depend on really are.
Okay, so what exactly is a power vacuum? It's not just an empty throne, not by a long shot. It's that one critical moment when the person holding everything together is suddenly just gone. And there's no plan, no clear successor, and no institution strong enough to fill that void. That's when things get interesting.
So for our first case study, let's jump way back to the ancient world. We're going to talk about an empire that was less a country and more the personal passion project of one absolutely brilliant, unstoppable guy.
I mean, just try to wrap your head around the scale of this. By the time he was 30 years old, his empire stretched from Greece all the way to the Indus Valley. But here's the crucial part. It was all held together by personal loyalty to him. He didn't just conquer territory, he was the entire political framework.
And look at how fast it all fell apart. For more than a decade, he's building this massive, massive structure. Then boom, he dies suddenly at just 32 years old with no adult heir and zero plan for what comes next. Almost overnight, the question wasn't even who will rule, but should this empire even exist anymore?
The results were immediate. His generals, known as the Diadochi, they didn't really want to destroy the empire, they just couldn't agree on how to run it without him, so they just carved it up. What came next was 40 years of war, which created all these new kingdoms and, ironically, weakened the whole region, just enough for the next big power, Rome, to eventually march right in. And that really is the perfect summary, isn't it? It wasn't an empire of institutions. It was an empire built on one man's charisma and sheer genius. The second he was gone, the system he created just couldn't function anymore.
All right, let's jump forward about 2,000 years. Europe in 1914 was an absolute powder keg of alliances, nationalism, and military buildups, just waiting to explode. And right into this incredibly tense situation steps one assassin with a pistol.
Now, we all learn in school that the assassination of Franz Ferdinand caused World War I, but the reality is a lot more complicated, and frankly, a lot more terrifying. The war was probably coming anyway. What Franz Ferdinand's death really did was remove one of the very few powerful voices in the Austro-Hungarian Empire who was actively trying to stop it. See, he believed that giving more autonomy to Slavic peoples was the only way to hold the fragile empire together, a view that put him on a collision course with the military hardliners.
So, with him gone, the hardliners took over. The power vacuum wasn't at the very top of the empire, but it was inside its decision-making. It completely shifted the balance toward aggression. Austria-Hungary issued its ultimatum, all those rigid alliance systems kicked in, and an entire continent stumbled into a war that pretty much nobody could stop. The best way to think of it is this. His death didn't light the fire, it removed the fire extinguisher.
Okay, for our final case study, we're going to look at a completely different kind of power vacuum. This isn't about military might or a political office. This is about what happens when a nation loses its moral compass.
And this is a really critical idea. Authority isn't always about weapons or laws. Sometimes the most powerful force for stability is just one person's moral influence.
After independence, he didn't hold any official government post. He wasn't a general, he wasn't a president, but he was the conscience of the nation. He was the most powerful voice for non-violence and for reconciliation between Hindus and Muslims, especially after the horrifying violence of the partition.
When he was assassinated in 1948, the state didn't collapse. Democracy continued. But that moral center, that unifying restraint, was just gone. The loudest voice for peace was silenced. And while it didn't cause immediate political chaos, it fundamentally changed the long-term tone of Indian politics. It allowed those sectarian tensions to deepen without his calming influence.
So as we've seen, a power vacuum can take a whole lot of different forms. For Alexander, it was the loss of a military and political unifier. For Austria-Hungary, it was the loss of a political break, a voice of moderation.
And for India, it was the loss of a moral, almost psychological anchor.
And that leaves us with a pretty unsettling question to think about, doesn't it? Whether it's a giant global company, a political movement, or even an entire country, how many of the systems we see as stable are actually just one heartbeat away from chaos? What happens when they're gone?